Okay, everyone, if we could take your seats, I think we'll get started here. First, my name is David Bracht. I am with the law firm Kutak and have been involved in and was one of the people that raised my hand to attended every one of the 18 wind and solar conferences. Actually, I was telling Chris about my claim to fame was, I think it was the last time we were in Kearney, maybe that was why, I introduced a speaker and took a header off of the back of the panel of the dais here. Fortunately, I was able to get right back up and calm the crowd because they were so worried about my health. No, I'm not sure if they noticed, but anyway, I appreciate you being here and hearing what I think is probably one of the more important topics that we have, today. And in my practice, I spend a lot of time in local communities. And certainly what we have in Nebraska, just by way of background too, I spent time, in addition to my legal practice or in the midst of my legal practice, I stepped away for a bit and was state energy director, director of the Nebraska Energy Office for Governor Ricketts. And so I've been involved in renewable energy throughout my 25 years, almost actually 30 years now of legal career, including wind and solar, but also ethanol and a lot of other agriculture-related things. And my entire career then has been involved in economic development. Really, before I was a lawyer, I was a banker, working with businesses and how do we support our rural communities. And I think that's one of the things that I face in my practice today is how to communicate and help candidly calm some of the fears and concerns that people in communities sincerely have. A lot of them are sincere concerns. I would say not all, but a lot of them are sincere concerns. And for that, for our discussion today on that topic, we have really a great panel. I'm going to introduce them kind of in reverse order of what their speaking order is going to be, in part because I want to start with my friend Alan Anderson. Alan and I actually worked at the same firm about 25 years ago. So of course you should not don't believe anything he says, even if he would pretend that he does. But no, Alan is yes. And I think they're up. I got it ready. Sorry. So Alan and I practiced together, and in fact, this would have been in the early 2000s and 2010s. Worked quite a little bit on ethanol. That was during, those of you that are from Nebraska are familiar with that we had a huge build out in ethanol. Alan now practices and is chair of the energy department with Polsinelli, one of the major law firms in Kansas City, practices and speaks all around the country on, especially here in the Midwest, on wind, and is going to have a very I'm interesting, and I've heard him speak passionate presentation about property rights. On the other end, from a personal knowledge standpoint, is Jonny Rogers, and who I've just met in connection with this conference. Step one, all of you from Nebraska, raise your hands. Okay, this is not the Jonny Rogers. And in fact, it is spelled differently, just in case you're not quite certain of it. It's Jonny. Dr. Rogers, we'll call him that, is a professor at Georgia Tech University, specializes in aerospace engineering, and he is going to answer in his presentation. Well, how many of you have heard the old saying, if a woodchuck could chuck wood, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck? He is going to answer that question that we all want to know. If a turbine could fling ice, how much ice would a turbine fling? So I'm looking forward to that. And then finally, Chris Ollson. And again, how many of you from Nebraska? Lots of people here. This is Ollson 2 L's 1 S, not Olson's 1 L 2 S's. So just for the distinction here, Chris, who I've got to work with recently on some projects, is nationally known and speaks all over the country. He hails from Toronto, Canada, but really focuses on the environmental health aspects of renewable energy. And again, what's particularly pertinent to me, and just to go back again to where I started, so when I'm in front of a planning and zoning commission, I would say most, I'll admit, again, not all, but most of those concerns are really sincerely held concerns that I'm hearing from those members of the community. The reality is in Nebraska, we've got some areas where we've had wind, and in fact have had wind for 25, 30 years. So there was a chart I think one of the speakers had that showed that. But we've got large areas of the state that haven't had that wind. And in fact, most of our wind, this is a brag, sorry, hidden. If you saw that chart early on when Aaron was talking this morning at the welcome, 2015, that's when I joined the energy office. That's the hockey stick. Really didn't have that much to do with me. It had to do with some state legislation. But most of the wind in our state has been operating for about 10 years. And most of the communities that many of us are in, those people in those communities are 1, 2, 3 counties away. So this is all new to them. Even though, again, other parts of the state, we've had wind for 20 years. If I go across the river in Iowa, they've had wind for 50 years. So even though those concerns are sincerely held, it's up to us to communicate that and what's that experience been, and really make it a science-based and expert-based experience. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to start off with that. How do we get experts involved in these discussions?
I do have the clicker. Thanks, David. Thanks for the kind words. I was going to say good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, folks. My name is Chris Ollson. I have a PhD in environmental health sciences. This is my 4th Nebraska conference. Some of you may remember a couple years ago, I gave a presentation. I think it was the 9 in the morning, second day, everybody hungover presentation on public health, safety, and welfare. And that's what I do for a living. So when I come to work every day, I started my career off in oil and gas, like most of you. Still do quite a bit of work on gas plants, air quality emissions, and the like. And just over 15 years ago, got involved in the renewable energy sector. Got a call. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning. I was having renovations done at my house, was at home before anybody got to work at home back in those days. And a project manager said, we need a health section on wind turbines. We need it in 72 hours for an application. I said, Peter, you got to stop drinking at your desk, at least wait until noon. What are you talking about? Wind, health, and the like. So I'm not going to talk about the public health and safety aspects so much today. What I am going to talk about is how do you engage certain experts as you're going through your county commission hearings. I've been working in Nebraska for just over 12 years on various projects, mainly in the wind section at this point. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So this slide can be taken one of two ways, right? So this is the preacher's wife from The Simpsons. Won't somebody think of the children? And often when we get in these communities, we do see the opposition as, they're disingenuous, they're not well-meaning. You've all been there where the public health nurse brings 4-inch binders full of the science that says that solar setting's bad, EMF's going to kill y'all, battery storage fires and everything else. And that's one thing we definitely have to combat, that misinformation with real science, facts, and figures and engineering. But on the flip side of that, there are those families that are genuinely concerned for their family, for their little kids. Too many times we get into a community where, it's going to be wind, for example, and you've got a young mother with a severely autistic child who's concerned about the rotating blades and how that's going to affect their children. You may be near a solar project where you've got a neurological disorder of a family member. And so these can be really genuine concerns. We have to have the empathy to deal with those who are genuinely concerned and work with those people. Always encourage developers. Those are the people you work with one-on-one first. You do not want that young mother showing up at your community meeting saying that, company X did not talk to me. I reached out to them. They just gave me a bunch of bullshit fact and figures of like, everything's going to be awesome, right? So we do have to work with communities. Speaking of misinformation and, the president right now, this is not from last week. This is not from last month. This is not from 8 months ago and all the executive orders. Alan and I were actually in Reno County, Kansas, the day that President Trump came out and said wind turbines cause cancer. All right. We were in a 5-day meeting, a 5-day hearing with 500 people in a ballroom in Hutchinson. And of course, we're having to deal with this stuff. There's a lot of misinformation, and it's grown very much from the federal level, some of the state levels, depending on the state you're in. And then we have to be able to deal with this. We hear, and you folks hear all the time, the president says this is not good for us. So how do you deal with that? This is what the community sees as your projects, unfortunately. Right? So battery storage, they're always on fire. Wind turbines, they're always falling down. Blades are going to come off. Ice is going to be thrown. That's what Dr. Rogers is going to take us through. On the solar projects, Put your hand up if you know about the solar project in Nebraska where there's a massive hailstorm a couple of years ago and damaged every one of the panels, right? And there was a session last year on it with the developer who was here for that. Massive hailstorms can cause damage to panels and take things out. But does that mean that you're going to have leaching of toxic material from those panels into the soil and groundwater? No, it does not. We have the science and engineering that this is what the community is going to come to the county commission, the planning commission with. You need to make sure that not only as developers, of course, the developers have to be well versed in the field of what they're doing. They've got their internal staff that can come and help. But when is it appropriate? When should you be bringing experts to that table? It should never be at the last county commission hearing for your permit hearing for your CUP or SUP that you're introducing somebody like Dr. Rogers to say, okay, well, I'll tell you that ice won't be shed from the turbines. That engagement has to start a lot earlier on. So Avengers Assemble, right? Who are these team of experts? Who do you need to bring into the room? You don't always need experts. Of course, for a lot of you as developers, you do a good job of working your communities. And the experts aren't meant to replace the campaigns teams now that we see all over the state and all over the country where they're trying to get local support, getting the local people coming out, you know, your local school board superintendent talking about the money and all the good that it'll do. So what type of people do we have here, right? So you've got Dr. Rogers who can talk about, you know, blade failure, ice throw, aviation, and, you know, how many times have we heard that you can't possibly crop dust, right? So somebody like Dr. Rogers coming in to deal with those types of things. You got people like Rich Lampeter sitting in the middle of the room back there on the acoustics side, where Rich has spent 20 years in communities trying to take acoustics, which can be a very complicated discussion to have, and bring it back to the community, put it into perspective that we can properly cite these things. The most recent group of experts that we've seen enter into this field are the fire protection engineers and the firefighters on the battery storage side. It's one thing for you as developers to go in and say, first of all, if you hear anybody else ever say, oh, these things never catch fire. They do catch fire. It's very rare, okay? But it's trying to explain what happens to that fire side. What are our fire protection engineers doing? How they're going to work with the local fire chief. All of those things that happen before you get into your permit hearing, it's bringing in these experts. You've got folks like the Ollson folks spelled wrong. I don't know how that happened, but you're bringing in your bird and bat biologists, you're bringing in your wetland specialists, having all these people. It's one thing to have them go out and do these actual reports. It's another thing to have them be able to come in, because ultimately what we're trying to do is provide county planning and zoning commissions and county commissioners. I always call it, we're providing them the cover that they need so that they can make informed decisions when we have the same 40 people. I don't care if, you know, I'm in Eastern Nebraska, Western Nebraska, Colorado, New York State. It's the same 40 people. You can put me on a Delta airplane on Monday morning, blindfold me, drop me off the community. They're all the same concerns because, of course, Facebook and everything else. That we have done a horrible job as an industry over, I'd say, the last 5-10 years in actually fighting misinformation. Too often we would cower in the corner. We wouldn't want to upset people because you don't want to upset somebody who's from the community. We've done a lot better job, I'd say, in the last 2-3 years as an industry, whether it's solar, wind, or battery storage, in actually bringing the facts and figures. It's one thing to bring the facts and figures. You need to have somebody who can tell that story appropriately, though, to the county commissioners. You have to be able to do that. You need to be prepared. You know that you're going to potentially, if you're in an area where they don't have any wind, they don't have any solar, especially now solar and battery storage, where it's new technology for them. You need to be able to bring the facts and the figures to the commissioners. Hold a town hall. Too often we shy away from town halls. We're going to have storyboard open houses. We're all going to walk around like it's a science fair. Isn't this great? People want to yell at you. All right. So why get yelled at? So your county commissioners, your planning commissioners who are in attendance can see that you have the information. You can combat the misinformation and provide the real facts. Use science and engineering. We're going to hear a lot of good stuff from Dr. Rogers. He's going to get into some of the technical stuff here in a minute, but you have to be able to communicate it appropriately. So when to bring the experts? It's going to that community. Most of you have campaigns teams now, or these PRGR firms now. They're great at trying to understand what's going on in the local community. You've got internal folks like Chris Evans at Exterra is sitting there listening attentively, right? That you have these people who are trying to develop the issues. What are the issues to that local community? And then making sure you bring the right people in at the right time to have that discussion. Not everybody, just because you went to school and you spent too many years in school like I did or Dr. Rogers did, does not mean you should be ever allowed to speak to the public, right? Too many times you put an expert up there, they've lost everybody in 5 seconds, nobody has any idea what they're doing. So making sure you've got the right people, Go in early to the community, be at those open houses and public meetings if you need to. Certainly the first time you introduce an expert should not be at a CUP hearing. And if you do all of those things, because this is, of course, what we know our projects look like, right? The sun's shining, it's great. You know, the panels are doing their thing. They withstand 4-inch hail at 80 miles per hour. It's the 5-inch and 10-inch hail balls that come down to break the panels. Nothing's going to leach out. Your wind turbines aren't going to be falling over and all that. And your battery storage is very rarely catch fire. So it's engaging the experts early and often at the right time in the appropriate spot to help give your county commissioners cover to allow them to help hopefully approve your projects in a timely manner. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rogers.
All right. Well, welcome everyone, and I'm glad to be here today. I'm having some problems turning my timer on my phone here. Here we go. All right. So good to be in Nebraska. This is my first time being here, and I always get a knowing look when I introduce myself to people in Nebraska, even though I was named after another Jonny that's also a football player, but not the one you're thinking of. My dad was a huge Colts fan, and thus Jonny Unitas was my namesake. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is setbacks in particular, and what I've studied over the past 10 years and what the science says about what proper setbacks are, in particular for wind projects. So when we think about permitting these projects, one of the big topics that's come up quite a bit over the years is setbacks. You know, is it safe to put turbines near roads? Is it safe to put them near homes? What is the right setback distance? And oftentimes, we hear the term exclusionary setbacks, right? Setbacks are used as a way to keep wind projects out. And so when you guys are going to these county meetings and putting forward these permit applications, a lot of times bringing some data and some scientific data to the table to show why the setbacks that you're using are appropriate and safe can be quite valuable. Now, you're not there to convince everyone and all the opposition members about why the setbacks are safe, right? But you're trying to provide information to people who maybe are on the fence and don't know what to believe, right? Or people who want to vote yes but need some reason to explain why they're voting yes, right? So this is the reason why we're bringing scientific data forward for people to see. So over the past 10 years, so about, 10 plus years ago or so, I was contacted by SoCal Edison to do an analysis on how far a wind turbine blade piece could go if the blade failed, right? And they were mostly interested in their transmission infrastructure and making sure that their substations were far enough back and would be protected from these types of events. And the reason they reached out to me at Georgia Tech is because my legacy of research is in ballistics and projectiles and missiles. And in fact, that's what I spend most of my time doing. Wind turbine stuff is only a tiny fraction. I spend most of my time doing defense work. But we have the models, and all we have to do is swap out what we're modeling, and it's different aerodynamics, different shapes, et cetera. And now we can look at how far a blade piece would go or how far an ice piece would go. And so we've developed these models over the years that simulate blade pieces coming off and ice pieces coming off, looking at how far they go and looking at what a safe setback is and trying to then articulate that to the community, giving you guys information or coming to county meetings and showing decision makers, why the setbacks that have been proposed are protective of public safety. So our models are validated, they have experimental data behind them, and we have a high degree of trust in them. So I'll show you a couple of examples. The first one is ice throw. So blades collect ice pieces just like anything you leave out in the wintertime, right? And just like a car, just like an aircraft wing, a helicopter blade, ice accumulates during certain portions of the year. And when you get these thawing conditions, if you leave the turbine spinning, these ice pieces come off and they go a certain distance. That's partially a function of how fast that rotor is spinning, right? And at various county meetings and online, you'll see concern about ice throw, and we need to have these turbines set back half a mile or a mile to protect from this phenomenon. And it turns out that in Sweden and Scandinavia, they've been studying this for a long time, and they've done studies. They've let turbines, quote, throw ice pieces and gone and collected the pieces and see how far they go. And our models have been validated against those. Our models predict the same exact thing that these experiments showed. And so let's go through an example of how we look at, setbacks and what's an appropriate setback for a turbine when we're considering, ice throw. And the first thing to notice is that when we simulate ice throw for turbines, 1.1 times tip height is a great benchmark to use that contains almost all the pieces that come off, even if you leave the turbine running all the time. So in these simulations we run, doesn't matter the size of the turbine, how big it is, how tall it is, 1.1 times tip height is a good perimeter that contains, in this case, 99.7% of the pieces, but this was out of tens or hundreds of thousands of simulations, and we're collecting just all but a handful of ice pieces. And the ones that do go beyond that are tiny. They're on the order of grams, so they don't pose any risk to people. It would be like a little piece of snow blowing in the wind, essentially. So this is a great benchmark that's scientifically proven with validated models. Now, one of the other things that we do when we do analyses for folks like you, when we give data, is not just the plot on the left, which honestly looks scary to people, right? I mean, what are they supposed to think of these pieces everywhere? Can't really interpret what it means. We try to distill this down into a risk that we can articulate very clearly. So I put an equation up here just, because I'm a professor, I have to put one equation on every slide deck, okay? But forget the equation. The equation is basically looking at if you compound all the risks, all the factors involved in an ice piece potentially hurting someone from a wind turbine blade. Not only does it have to come off the blade, it has to go the right distance, it has to go the right direction, someone or something has to be at the exact point that it lands. All those factors combined, compounded together, you get an absolutely tiny risk that this could ever pose, cause injury to anyone. So something like, for this example, 1 in 40,000 years, you could cause an injury to someone, right? And again, 1 in 40,000 years, is that a big risk or a small risk? Well, it turns out 1 in 40,000 years is an absolutely tiny risk, right? It's actually 4 times less than the risk associated with having stairs in your home, right? If you have stairs in your home, there's a certain risk you can fall down those stairs and kill yourself, right? Well, about 1 in 10,000 years is the risk for that, okay? If you live to be 10,000 years old, it would probably happen at one point during your lifetime, right? So 1 in 40,000 years is 4 times less than the risk of having stairs in your home. This is how we articulate the risk to people who maybe aren't so engineering minded, right? The other thing that I try to point out to folks is that it's not about the maximum distance something can get thrown. That's a question I get asked a lot, is like, how far can an ice piece go? Well, how far do you want it to go? I could put 200, 300 mile an hour winds in my model. I can make it go 4 miles, right? The point is we have to look at realistic conditions. We don't want to talk about how far can something go. We want to talk about risk. And the risk is extremely low when we benchmark it against every common risk that comes up in everyday life. Another thing that is often brought to the table, and I was just in a hearing with Alan last week, a lot of times members of the community who are opposed to the project will they'll find examples online of things that have happened, and they'll bring printouts and they'll say, look, this happened, right? And we don't want this happening in our community. And an example that we're seeing come up is the blade failure that happened last year, 2 years ago in Kansas at the Irish Creek Wind Farm. And in this incident, a bolt of lightning struck one of the wind turbine blades and caused it to break apart, okay, which is fairly uncommon, but it sometimes does happen. Now, in this case, pieces were scattered beyond 1.1 times tip height, okay? So these were sighted 1.1 times tip height from these roads, and pieces were scattered across the road, and the remediation had to be done to pick up these pieces. So Chris and I collaborated on a project to understand how these pieces got beyond that setback and whether they would pose a risk to anyone. Now, when blades fail, oftentimes what happens, in fact, this is what happens all the time, there's a handful of big pieces and a ton of little tiny small pieces, right? You take this composite material and you break it, it comes off in a few big chunks, and then there's some real small slivers of stuff like foam that just come off, right? And in this case, there were very, very high winds and blew some of those little strands and little pieces of foam, farther distances than 1.1 times tip height. So So I did a ballistics analysis. I looked at, how fast those pieces might have been going when they hit the ground, and benchmarked it against, different metrics for injury, and found that none of those pieces could ever have harmed anyone, and were similar to a leaf blowing in the wind, right? So they came off the turbine in high wind conditions. They were blowing around, and if someone had been there, then they would never have caused injury. So all the pieces that could hurt anyone fall straight down within that 1.1 times tip height setback. So even though these examples sometimes illustrate that you might find small pieces beyond that setback, the point is that nothing that's harmful can go beyond that distance, and thus it's still protected. So these are some of the analyses we run and some of the way we bring scientific methods to the table. What we try to do is document our research in peer-reviewed studies. When we come to hearings, it's not enough to come as a consultant, right? I come as a professor and I bring peer-reviewed material to the hearing, because that's, if anything's trusted, then it has to be peer-reviewed, right? Otherwise, it looks like, you're biased. You've been paid by so-and-so to come in here and give your opinion. So we try to pull documents from the literature, and sometimes I don't pull my own literature. I pull other people's peer-reviewed papers, because honestly, it all says the same thing. Last thing I'll mention, and just to kind of distill down what I've mentioned into talking points, the 1.1 times tip height setback, or the setbacks that we commonly use in Nebraska and throughout the Midwest, honestly, they have a flawless track record. When you have 76,000 giant industrial machines operating throughout the country and no one's ever been hurt by a piece of ice or a piece of blade, that's a really good track record that we should be touting as a community, and it should be the number one thing we're saying in response to all of these concerns, right? We have peer-reviewed studies, and we're looking at extremely small risks that are far lower than risks incurred in everyday life. As I wrap up my 10 minutes, I want to mention one more thing that we've done over the years. Aviation comes up a lot when we're talking about wind turbines, and there's a lot of ag aviation here in Nebraska. Another way that we've brought scientific studies to bear on these concerns is looking at, how safe is it to fly near wind turbines? So a couple of years ago, I collaborated with Capital Power, which is a utility in Canada, to fly near wind turbines and do flight tests. So we instrumented this aircraft and had a pilot and a passenger go fly through a wind farm, including this flight, which was only 1.5 rotor diameters away from a operating industrial scale turbine, and found that the turbulence and the flight through this wind farm was completely safe. Some pilots claim that it's too turbulent to fly near wind turbines. Well, I have a video here. Let's watch how turbulent it is as you fly 1.5 rotor diameters downwind of a wind turbine. This video is maybe 30, 45 seconds long. And, spoiler alert, it's quite boring, which is the good news for us, right? We did 13 of these wake passes, collected a lot of data, and published it in this scientific paper. And this paper, I think we just passed by the turbine on our right. You might have been able to see the blades, but there's no discernible turbulence, even at this extremely close distance. This paper has, there's the turbine. Yeah, you'll see it go by on the right here. This paper has moved the needle on wind farms and led to projects being approved that otherwise haven't been approved. So it's an example of how, in some cases, scientific studies can prove pivotal. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alan. Whenever you want, or you got it. You're gonna bring it back. Okay.
Well, you'll see, I'll just tee it up too. The developers in the audience owe me something for the energy that I used to create this presentation, so I did some work for you. But I'm Alan Anderson, so I'm the chair of the Polsinelli Law Firm's Energy Practice Group. It's creating the right foundation in order to, for rural engagement. So the property rights story. So we hear about property rights a lot. We're gonna talk about it deeply, and we're gonna talk about it accurately and from the origin story. Like I said, so I'm the chair of the Energy Practice Group. This is the Polsinelli Law Firm. We're about 1,200 lawyers across the country and work on projects. I'm going to talk about property rights here. Sometimes I play the role of lawyer. Other times I play a consultant, or I come in on things related to the grid because of this role. So I'm a professor at the University of Kansas, and as a fellow Big 8 member, because I don't recognize conference realignment, but a fellow Big 8 member with Nebraska, it's good to be here with you all. But then I'll come in because things get brought up, even if they're extraneous to the core issue of like a permit. It could be the grid. So how does the energy work? Is this good? Subsidies, all those different things. I'll talk about how renewables work within the context of the grid and why it's good for communities. And this one I'll talk about property rights. I'll be up in Montana tomorrow talking to a group there using this hat, my professor hat on in relation to these issues. So this is a real picture of James Madison. And so James Madison was kind of our founding father that was the property rights founding father. And so we had just won the Revolutionary War. So I mean, I'm really going back to the origin story. And the question was, what kind of country would we become? That was not a settled issue. So the founding fathers write the Constitution. And it wasn't a sure thing that we would actually ratify the Constitution. So Madison and others wrote the Federalist Papers. And these were the papers that were meant to be the reason why we should ratify the Constitution. Federalist Paper number 10 is one of the most important political documents ever written, and I'll get into this part of it, which is core into the property rights. So it was written in 1787 in furtherance of the ratification. It was published in New York for a group there that was, teetering. We weren't sure if they were going to pass it. And what Madison told us is, as we create a country and a system, we need to be worried about what he called factions. It's groups that would get together and take away rights of others, and including the majority within a group. And so certain things were fundamental, and we needed to have systems to protect against that. And he believed one of the main area was property rights. Madison would later go on to write the Fifth Amendment, which we know as the protection of life, liberty, and property. And Madison wrote quite a bit about this later on. He believed property rights were quite literally equal to life and liberty because it was that important. If we didn't have the ability to express our freedom with our property rights, life and liberty were at risk. So it was equal to those. So he was worried about people getting together and taking their neighbors' property rights. He saw that around the world. It could be a physical taking. A group could gather, a mob can come and just take someone's property. Or what he worried, and this couldn't be more prescient to where we are right now, a group within a community could go petition the government to take their neighbor's property away. That could be because they're too successful, could be that they're the wrong religion, whatever it may be. He was afraid that a group would get together, go to their government, and legally take away their property rights. So hence we have the Constitution and later the Fifth Amendment. Here he is with a farmer. He enjoyed farming. We'll talk about that. So his few fundamental principles about property rights, and he wrote many other documents on this. I mean, when I say how he viewed on property rights, he was very serious about it because he believed that property rights are how we express liberty. It's how we take care of our families. It's how we survive. And you can imagine, obviously, at this time, that was even more prescient with fewer safety nets and things in place. The taking of people's property rights is the taking away of liberty, and he viewed it that strongly. And then what he viewed, again, is that once we do something healthy and safe, so that's what Dr. Rogers and Dr. Ollson and others, and Rich Lampeter and Ollson, we make sure we cite these projects correctly. If we don't cite them correctly, we should have no right to do these projects, but we do know how to do it. As Jonny mentioned, 76,000 turbines. We absolutely know how to cite these safely and accurately. Once we get there, then it's government's job to protect people from taking away their property rights. When these groups get together and petition the government, say, I want to take away my neighbor's property rights, Madison and the Founding Fathers believed it's the government's job to say, no, we're not going to take away our neighbor's property rights regardless of the group getting together. So he also believed that include economic choices. And Professor Alkian here reminds us, and he was professor, now he's since deceased, but he wrote for the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, professor at UCLA. One of the things we forget, and you can read the quote there, that the key to a capitalist economic free market system is a strong sense of property rights. It's also the thing we get wrong, and I'll get to how we get it wrong and how you all hear that in different communities. So if we're applying these kind of key tenets to the Founding Fathers, how they believed when we ratified the Constitution what property rights meant, it never has meant that there's no activity on someone's land. So when someone comes forward and says, I want to look at my neighbor's property the way I want, and I want them to do it the way I should look at it, and I want no activity on there that I don't think is appropriate, That's never been a constitutional-based principle on property rights. In fact, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they were farmers. And if those of you are farmers, I grew up in the country, it meant activity, it means smells, it means things are going on in the land. And so that's what they believed. So it didn't mean to tell my neighbor they couldn't have some healthy activity. So claims that you should block a safe use of the property are absolutely antithetical to property rights as we saw it. So when someone says, yeah, what about my property rights? What's important there is we do it healthy and safe. And when we do that, we are protecting that neighbor's property rights. Now we have to protect against them going the other direction and taking the property rights. Now, I will tell you, there is another economic system that does believe in the taking of natural resources from the people's use. You might understand that to be communism. And that is, here's the definition, political and economic doctrine that aims to replace private property with public ownerships and communal control over natural resources. So when people come and they say, we've got a healthy and safe use on this property, but I want to take my neighbor's right away from this, that's much more akin and close to communist system. And that's just the way it is. There's the definition. When they do that, we have healthy and safe use. We are straying so far away from private property rights in a free market system, and we're getting much closer here. So we have to remember that. We have to be bold in the communities to do that. And so, whoops, I got it there. So if we believe in property rights and the free market capitalism, we, again, like I said, can be bold. We can be strong on this point. I gave you a little flash of the thing. Let's go. Let's go into those communities and get it right, because we're right on this issue, so we should be strong on it. So with that, I think we've got time for questions.
As I said, very passionate there, you can tell. So we have about a little less than 10 minutes, between 5 and 10 minutes for some questions. And anyone in the audience? I see one in the back there, Dave. And they'll bring a microphone to you.
Thank you. As an emeritus professor, here's what I would like you to respond to. You're from a university, it's leftist, you're being paid by left-wing people to come up with your research. That's often arguments that's made. How do you counter that?
Well, I think like you heard with others, so I'm at the University of Kansas. It's a nice Midwestern university, so we start there. The second is everything I say can be challenged. So when I teach my class, push, prod, tell me where it's wrong, and happy to have that discussion. So where we kind of, and I think this is true of all of us, where we get past that is consistency and being right. I'm not going to tell you something that I think is not accurate just for the sake of the industry. I'm going to do it because I want to do this for the next 10 years, not the next 10 minutes. So we do get that some, and they say you're part of it, but I think it's the consistency, the accuracy, and the bringing the true information and doing that rinse and repeat, and eventually you get a lot of credibility from that.
And I think just to add to that, as Professor Rogers said, we publish our work in peer-reviewed scientific journals, credible journals. There's two tiers of journals these days. There's the peer-reviewed credible journals, and then there's what we call the pay-to-play crap, where I can get $250 together and publish that I had 100 people in this room and you guys were all smiling. So it's that peer-reviewed published side, and then in addition to that, it's also that the same things that Dr. Rogers and I talk about in any community, like tomorrow again, I'm going with Alan to Montana, are the same things I've said under oath to public services commissions, same things I've said in court. The message is consistent. So do I get paid to do it? I do. This is what I do for a living, and I'm a professional at what I do.
David, and just to note, this is the last David, at least for two others. So we've had three Davids in a row talk. We don't want to, go ahead.
Yes, and I should identify myself as David Bagley, Special Knox County, Nebraska Attorney, and this is for the professor. You completely skipped over the right of a local community to zone, and that has been the law in the country since the Village of Euclid. But I do want to advise you and inform the people in this room that Senior Judge John Gerard, federal court here in Lincoln, wrote in my case, Norfolk Wind versus Knox County, that there is no prohibition under state or federal law to prevent a community from banning commercial wind and solar. And that's what Knox County did. And the Board of Supervisors gave 18 good reasons why they did ban wind and solar. So I'd like to hear your response.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I didn't say is that a community can't do that. So I've never said that a county couldn't make the decision not to have wind and solar or battery storage or clean water, whatever they want to do to block. Counties can do a lot of things. So that's not what I said. What I said is if we look at what the basic principles of property rights from how our country was founded, that's the story. So if you're taking away your neighbor's property rights, that's great. Whatever county you're talking about, I'm not a Nebraska lawyer. They just took away their neighbor's property rights. That's not a community that understands capitalism or the free market very well. That's one that is not going to, when someone has the farm that can't pay the mortgage, that's not, the people aren't going to come pay that mortgage for them. So counties can do what they want. It's like I tell my kids, just because the neighbor kid did something, that's not a good reason for another one to do it. It's the same thing here. So could a county do it? That's for Nebraska lawyers to decide. Sounds like possibly. But should they do it? Should they? Because what you'll find, and there's just brand new research, and I don't want to go too long, but the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory just did a study that came out that communities that host wind projects thrive. And you can imagine, they have better infrastructure, they have better schools, they have more money for different things, they thrive. So if counties want to make decisions that are harmful to themselves, many have that choice.
And I'll add to that. If every county in the United States decided that they were going to ban energy production, whether it's a gas plant, a wind plant, a solar project, we'd all be screwed. The lights wouldn't be on here. None of you would have got over here. And so the role I think that we try to play, especially Dr. Rogers and myself, is what is an appropriate safe setback distance? What's the appropriate sound level? How are we going to keep the community health and safety, or health and safe? If the counties want to do that, that's fine. I hope that, and we certainly all know that we've got counties across this country that have been doing that, and it keeps going up. Good luck keeping the lights on, let alone the data centers.
To that point, I might add too, because as I said, I've spent my whole career in economic development, and the thing that I really am concerned about is what is going to support the counties and these communities in our rural counties. And I bring up that point because people's perspectives can change. I was around, Alan and I were working on ethanol plants in the early 2000s. And it's hard to believe today in Nebraska, where ethanol is a critical part and it's spread, the most significant rural economic development activity that we've had probably ever. I'm a cattle guy, so I'll say cattle does that too, but as far as a single targeted event that built our 25 ethanol plants, built the 45 that are in Iowa. In the early 2000s, the resistance to ethanol plants was every bit, and in some respects even worse, against. The cattlemen were just convinced that we were going to kill their industry. We were going to use up all their corn. I grew up on a cattle feed yard, not to get into it because this is wind, not ethanol. The single biggest thing for cattle feeding in Nebraska has been ethanol plants because we have distillers' grains. And I don't know what that is for, although I could come up with some ideas, but for wind and solar, but that's the concern that I have. And I bring up that example to show that 25 years ago, those people that were resisting that type of economic development were saying similar things to the people that are resisting economic development today, perhaps out of sincere concerns, but without the economic or factual underpinnings for that. Any more questions? We've probably got time for just one because I blathered too long. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're taking stuff that does not always happen. We've worked with a wind developer. They don't care about the landowner. They don't care about the county. Their taxes are always late. They trespass on ground they don't have contracts with. They ignore the contract. So why would anybody want it in their area?
I've worked on over 100 wind projects. I've worked over 50 solar projects and now over a dozen battery storage. I can lay claim to over 30 gigawatts of installed power across this country. I can also lay claim to the 10 gigawatts that did not get built because things got done. I think it's an overly broad statement. I'm sure and I know that individual projects have had challenges over the years. That's not the industry that I see.
Well, within the first year, every piece of ground had not one, but 2 liens put against it of over 36 million per parcel.
Yeah, similar. It sounds like you've got a specific situation. Can't speak to that, but similar to Chris, I have worked on so many projects, dozens and dozens now, probably well over 100. That's not the story that you see in these communities. Otherwise, we wouldn't. You can take counties where we've done 1, we've not done 2, we've not done 3. We've got counties where we've done 11. And the reason we did 11 is because the first 10 went really well. The story of what these do to communities is excellent. So again, it sounds like you've had experience. I appreciate that, but I can tell you that's not the story you see in these communities. That's not the economic story and the benefits to these communities, not even close. And to echo a point that was made earlier, if I was a country that didn't have the best interests of the United States in mind, I would do 2 things. I would divide the people amongst themselves so they're fighting amongst each other. Thanks social media that kind of contributed to that. And the second thing, I would do things to hamper the development of electricity in the grid, because without this new generation, we can't do it. So if we start to do these things to divide amongst ourselves and stop the ability to develop projects, we are so hurting the country. You're so hurting the state you're in, and we're hurting the country's ability to do the things we need economically and for national security. So this is just a critical thing. We've got to get this right, and it has to be based on facts and science, and we've got to work with these communities to make sure it happens.
I think we've got time for one more question, and I'll let David ask it now. So we've had sufficient numbers. Any other questions? Any other questions? Right here,
One up the front.
up front.
Yeah, I just had a question on messaging with the aesthetic argument you often see is that, you see it on the national level, at the local level, is that, wind turbines are incredibly ugly. It's destroying the landscape. Solar is incredibly ugly. It's destroying the landscape. Have you guys had any experience or recommendations on messaging with that, or how you guys talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, aesthetics is the one thing we'll say is if you see a turbine, you're going to see a turbine. If you see a solar panel, you're going to see a solar panel. And that we're not going to change. We won't make it invisible. We do a lot of things to make sure that it's appropriately from a visual standpoint. But I'll give an example of what a rancher once told me. He's a rancher out in this community, multi-generations, and he wanted to have a turbine on his land, and he was getting pushback. And so he went to his neighbors who were more recent than his multi-generations on a big ranch. And he said, you know what I don't like to look at? I don't like to look out at your houses. But I understand that you have the right to put your house there. So we all have to look at something we don't appreciate maybe exactly, but that doesn't form the basis for saying, I get to tell you everything I want to look at your land. I have 80 acres that just has grasses and a little lake, and I like to play on it. I don't do any farming on it, ranching. It's just to play. The neighbor farms. I don't go to my neighbor. I wish he wouldn't farm. It makes noises. It does all this stuff like that. Of course he gets the right to do it. So there is trade-offs in the world. Energy is critical infrastructure, so we have to have it. It's so critical that someone's going to look at something they don't like every day, and that is part of our life.
And I think in addition to that, we've come a long way on the visual aspect as well. Like if you look at solar projects now, and for all the solar developers in the room, there's a lot of vegetative buffer and screening that ends up getting done on these projects now. Tens of millions of dollars in some cases on some of these solar projects, which I think is a good thing, right? We are trying to minimize the impacts on the neighbors. If you look at wind, for example, you look at the older wind projects here in Nebraska that are 1.5 megawatt wind turbines, and you had to have 50, 100, 200 of those turbines up. Now we have a third of those. So there's a lot less visual impact on the landscape than there would have been on the smaller, older projects. It's certainly a concern that people raise, but as Alan said, I mean, just because you don't want to look at it does not mean that it's not something that should move forward. But we certainly have to be empathize, right? Because you also have multi-generational ranchers that have been there forever that do not want to look at that solar farm or whatever. So that really is, I think, on the developers to work closely with the community. The other thing you can do there too is good neighbor agreements. And I think we've come a long way with good neighbor agreements so that if you've got, you're adjacent landowner, no infrastructure, that you're signed up to get a little bit of money every year to kind of help offset some of those issues.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.